What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
It's funny how people can sit around a table, clinking glasses and smiling, pretending to celebrate love, family, and success, while under the surface there's nothing but years of rot slow, creeping decay disguised as tradition. I didn't organize that dinner out of kindness or excitement for my younger sister's engagement. I organized it because I needed a stage, a captive audience, and just enough red wine to lubricate the truth when it finally slithered out. I had planned every detail, from the wine pairings to the goddamn linen napkins, not because I cared about appearances, but because my mother did, and I wanted her calm, distracted, and unguarded. It was the first time in over 2 years that we were all together under one roof. Mom, her second husband Ron, my sister Paige, and her picture-perfect fiancé Tyler. It was a reunion, technically, but not the kind anyone really wanted. When I sent out the invitations, I called it a family dinner to keep it neutral. Not Thanksgiving, not Christmas, just a Thursday night meal in my house, with candles, meatloaf, and good intentions that reeked of passive aggression. Tyler and Paige arrived early. Paige, of course, brought a bottle of expensive white and a thin smile that had been rehearsed in a mirror somewhere between the hospital and the car. She was still in her scrubs, her hair tied up in that clean, no-nonsense bun that screamed responsibility. Tyler came in behind her, looking like something out of a J.Crew catalog, chinos, a button-down shirt just tight enough to show he worked out, and a watch that could probably pay someone's rent. He kissed my cheek like we were old friends and commented on how beautiful the table looked. I said, thanks, I YouTubed how to fold napkins for 2 hours just so Mom wouldn't accuse me of being lazy. He laughed. Paige didn't. When Mom arrived with Ron, she immediately started with her routine, walking through the house like she was on an inspection tour, fingering the edges of picture frames, lightly tapping countertops as if checking for dust, making mental notes of what to critique later in her usual sweet but smothering tone. She hugged me last. Said, "It's so good to see you taking time off from whatever it is you do." That was her version of a compliment. I'm 39, I run a software company that recently got acquired for a low 8 figures, and yet to her, I'm still the daughter who dropped out of med school and wore black to Easter dinner one year like some kind of gothic heretic. But tonight wasn't about correcting her assumptions. Tonight was about letting her live in them, just long enough to burn in them. Paige took the seat beside Mom, naturally. Tyler sat at the other end, next to Ron. I stayed by the kitchen a little longer than I needed to, sipping wine and watching them from the doorway, letting the fake laughter and shallow chatter float around me like cigarette smoke, noxious, but familiar. I waited until Mom had her second glass of Pinot Noir before I served dinner. That's the point where she starts to forget to censor herself. As we passed plates and exchanged meaningless updates, Paige saving babies, Ron retiling the patio, Mom lamenting the price of decent avocados, I stayed quiet, just smiling when spoken to, making sure the tension didn't rise too fast. I didn't want anyone suspecting that something else was coming. I needed this to feel like a normal night. I needed Paige to feel safe. I needed Tyler to get comfortable. At some point between the mashed potatoes and the roasted carrots, Paige said something about finally setting a wedding date, and Mom lit up like someone just handed her a grandchild. That's just wonderful, darling, she said, reaching over to touch Paige's hand. You've always had your priorities straight. You knew what you wanted and you went for it. I wish more people had that kind of drive. There was a pause in the room. Not long, just a breath's length. But long enough. Long enough for me to know what was coming. And then, right on cue, she added, you know, Paige, you're really the only one who did something with her life. It wasn't even the words that got me. It was the way she said it, casual, like she was observing the weather. Like I wasn't even there. Like the person who paid for the dinner, set the table, cooked every goddamn dish, and organized the evening wasn't sitting 3 feet away, silently chewing chicken. And then came the laughter. Ron gave a low chuckle, probably just trying to fill the silence. Paige smiled uncomfortably. Tyler laughed a little too loud, like he thought it would be rude not to. No one looked at me. No one apologized or softened the moment. It just passed over them like background music. I sat there and let them laugh. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. I picked up my wine glass, took a sip, and smiled. Not a big smile. Just enough to keep the room from shifting. Because I had already decided weeks ago that this would happen. I had made peace with it. I had accepted that I would never be the daughter that got the toast. And that was fine. Because I didn't want a toast. I wanted the silence after the glass shattered. Tyler reached for the breadbasket and caught my eye. For half a second, his smile faltered. Maybe he remembered. Maybe he wondered what I remembered. Or maybe he didn't think I ever would. But I did. I remembered everything. And tucked away inside my purse, sitting quietly beside my phone and a pack of mints, was an envelope. It wasn't thick. Just a few folded pages. Harmless looking. White. Clean. But inside it was a kind of truth that doesn't just blow up a dinner. It blows up everything. And I wasn't going to scream or cry or storm out. No. That would be too easy. I was going to wait until just the right moment. Until dessert. When the lights were low and everyone's bellies were full and their guards were down. I was going to wait until Paige cut the cake and Mom started another speech about perfection. And then I was going to put the envelope on the table. Quietly. And say 7 words. This might change the mood a little. And it would. Instantly. There's a kind of cruelty that doesn't leave bruises or scars, the kind that doesn't scream or slam doors, but rather lingers quietly in the way someone tilts their head when you speak, or in the way your name is left off a list of compliments, or in the awkward pauses that follow any mention of your life's direction when everyone at the table knows, or thinks they know, that you veered off course years ago and never quite made it back. That's the kind of cruelty my mother specialized in, a slow, generational drip of judgment dressed up as maternal concern, delivered with a smile and a polite chuckle, always just subtle enough to make me question whether I was the one overreacting. It didn't start that night at dinner. It started long before, years ago, back when Paige and I were still girls and everything was about comparison, even if no one ever said it out loud. Paige with her straight A's and clean handwriting, her science fair trophies and college scholarships, her ability to look polished even at 7 years old, while I was the one with messy thoughts and a tendency to wander. More interested in books I wasn't assigned than the ones I was, prone to asking questions at the wrong time and getting bored when things became too easy. I wasn't a bad kid, not in any way that mattered, but I wasn't Paige, and in our house, not being Paige was as close to failure as you could get. By the time high school ended, the roles were set in stone. Paige went off to Stanford with a full ride, pre-med of course, because she always wanted to help people, and it just so happened she was brilliant enough to actually do it. I, on the other hand, floated through a few different majors before finally landing on biomedical engineering, mostly because I liked the idea of building something real. But it didn't last. By the middle of my second year, I had dropped out, burned out, if you want to get technical about it, though that word was never spoken in our family. To my mother, I had simply quit, and that label stuck like grease. The truth, though, was more complicated, as it always is. I didn't leave school because I couldn't handle the work. I left because I couldn't handle the silence. I had fallen into something deep, something dark, and no one noticed. Or maybe they noticed and didn't care. I spent weeks walking through campus in a fog, attending lectures I barely heard, eating less and sleeping more until I just stopped going. I withdrew one afternoon with the same quiet energy I'd used to slip through family holidays, calm, apologetic, and entirely invisible. Of course, no one ever asked why. Not my mother, not Ron, and definitely not Paige. I suspect they were all too busy constructing the narrative they preferred, that I was unfocused, flaky, one of those creative types who couldn't stick with anything. It was easier for them to believe I had failed because I wasn't serious, not because I was drowning. Years passed, and while Paige marched her way through medical school, her life a perfectly executed checklist, I built something in the shadows. A software firm that started with just me and my laptop, coding until my eyes burned and sleeping under my desk some nights just to get ahead of the curve. I found a kind of satisfaction in building tools that worked, that solved real problems, that didn't need a parent's approval to exist. It wasn't glamorous, and for a long time it wasn't profitable, but it was mine. And eventually, it grew. Clients came, investors followed, and the company took off. But I never bragged, never brought it up at dinners or holidays, because I knew the moment I did, my mother would find some way to dismiss it as a hobby or as something less real than saving children in a hospital. The irony, of course, is that while Paige stitched bodies back together, I created technology that hospitals now use to track and manage organ transplants across the country. But that didn't make it into any of Mom's stories. So I played the game. I let them think I was still figuring things out. I wore old clothes when I visited, drove my older car to family gatherings even though I owned two others, and stayed vague about my schedule. I watched Paige bask in the spotlight, watched her bring Mom expensive gifts from medical conferences, and watched Mom weep over them like they were relics from the Vatican. And I let it happen. I smiled. I passed the mashed potatoes. I told them I was consulting and working on a few projects, when in reality, my name was on the title of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. There's a special kind of rage that simmers when you realize the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally have only ever loved you conditionally, and you stopped meeting the conditions a long time ago. That night, as I sat across from them and watched Paige glowing under the chandelier light, her left hand tilted just enough to let the diamond on her finger catch the room's attention like a flare gun, I could feel the weight of all those years pressing on my spine. My mother looked at her like she was a miracle made flesh. And maybe she was. But I wasn't the devil. I was just forgotten. When Mom raised her glass and said, to Paige, the only one who did something with her life, it didn't feel like a dagger. It felt like confirmation. This wasn't new. This was tradition. This was muscle memory. Everyone else laughed the way people laugh when they don't know what else to do. Ron cleared his throat, Tyler sipped his wine and looked at the floor, and Paige, God bless her, laughed too. Not loudly. Not cruelly. But she didn't stop it either. I watched them, then reached down beneath the table, unzipped my purse, and touched the envelope, still sealed, still waiting. I didn't pull it out, not yet. That moment would come later, after cake, after coffee, when everyone had relaxed again. But as my fingers brushed the edge of it, I felt something shift inside me. Not vengeance. Not bitterness. Just readiness. They thought they knew everything about me. But they didn't even know what I was capable of. There's a sound that lives in your head long after the moment has passed, a kind of laughter that doesn't just echo in your ears, but coils itself into your ribs, somewhere between shame and anger, where it tightens every time you breathe. That sound, that precise mix of casual dismissal and shared amusement at someone else's expense, has followed me my entire adult life, and though I've become adept at wearing a face that says I'm unaffected, the truth is that when my mother laughed that night, when the words had barely left her mouth, and the room leaned into the silence like a congregation waiting for the amen, I felt something in me give. Not break exactly, because you can only break so many times before there's nothing left to fracture. No, this was different. This was the sound of something finally sharpening. The wine was doing what it always did in our family, smoothing over discomfort just enough to allow the rudeness to slip through unnoticed, to pass as charm or wit or a harmless quip. Everyone at the table, in their own way, contributed to the ritual. Ron poured more than he drank and chuckled just loud enough to seem engaged while carefully avoiding any opinion of his own. Tyler, ever the golden fiancé, played along with whatever tone the room demanded, his face locked into that vaguely agreeable expression of a man who had not yet learned which jokes were traps. And Paige, well, Paige had the unique privilege of never needing to examine the weight of her mother's words, because none of them ever landed on her. So when my mother clinked her fork against her glass and said, with a look of loving pride that could win awards, to my baby girl, my brilliant, beautiful Paige, the only one who did something with her life, it wasn't said with malice or even deliberate cruelty. It was said with sincerity. That's what made it worse. She believed it. Every syllable. And when the laughter followed, some awkward, some genuine, all of it complicit, I sat there and smiled. Not because I found it funny. Not because I was numb. But because that smile, small and patient, was all I needed to keep the room exactly where I wanted it, relaxed, comfortable, unaware. For a moment, I let the silence return, that thick, sticky quiet that always comes after something ugly has been said and no one wants to admit they heard it. Then, without a word, I stood up and walked toward the kitchen, carrying empty plates like the good hostess I had pretended to be all evening. I didn't slam them down or bang drawers or crash the sink full of silverware. That would have broken the illusion. And illusions, when they're working, are far more powerful than outrage. It was as I stood rinsing the edges of the dessert plates that I heard the soft click of footsteps behind me, light and deliberate, followed by a familiar voice, low and careful, saying, "Emma, you okay?" I didn't need to turn around to know it was Tyler. I also didn't need to ask why he followed me. He hadn't said a word during my mother's toast, not one single syllable, and yet now, away from the table, behind closed doors, he wanted to offer concern. I paused, let the water run over my hands for a second longer than necessary, and then looked over my shoulder. He was closer than I expected, his hands in his pockets, his mouth curved into that sympathetic half-smile men wear when they want to seem emotionally available without committing to anything that might actually make them uncomfortable. "I'm fine," I said, too quickly, too flatly, which I knew he'd notice. He stepped a little closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, that expensive, woodsy scent that Paige had probably picked out for him at some boutique counter, something meant to say, refined masculinity in just 2 sprays. He looked at me the way you might look at a puzzle with one piece missing. "Look," he began, his voice now lower, "what your mom said. I mean, she probably didn't mean it the way it sounded." And there it was. The attempt at translation, the soft reframing of a blade into a butter knife. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I turned off the faucet, dried my hands slowly, and then, deliberately, I faced him. He looked at me in that long, assessing way that men do when they aren't sure if you're about to cry, scream, or kiss them. "You don't need to apologize for her," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. "She meant every word. She's been saying it for years. The only difference tonight is she finally said it with cake." He didn't laugh. Good. I didn't want him to. And then, almost as if the air had changed between us, he stepped back slightly, like he'd just remembered who I was. Or who I wasn't. Maybe he remembered the emails. Or maybe he was wondering if I still had them. Maybe the night I let him kiss me outside that bar in Atlanta for months before he proposed to my sister had just flashed in his mind. Maybe he remembered the way I'd stepped away, the way I hadn't said a word to Paige, the way I'd buried the whole night under the weight of "it didn't happen." But it had. And the emails that followed had happened too. The late-night confessions. The apologies. The brief flirtation that crossed a line just wide enough to ruin lives, but narrow enough to be explained away if one was desperate enough. He cleared his throat, looked toward the hallway, and said, "You coming back out for dessert?" I nodded. "In a minute." When he left the kitchen, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle again, then reached into the top drawer near the coffee pot and pulled out the envelope I had tucked there earlier, just in case. A simple white thing, no return address, no name, just sealed and waiting. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight, not in grams or ounces, but in consequences. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Not entirely. It was about balance. About restoring something that had always been skewed in one direction. About making sure that, for once, they saw me not as the black sheep or the afterthought or the one who never finished anything, but as someone capable of making choices that mattered. And when I stepped back into the dining room, as Paige began slicing into the cake and my mother prepared to launch into another sentimental monologue, I walked to the table with quiet certainty and placed the envelope beside the cake platter with a kind of casual elegance I didn't know I possessed. The room paused. Paige looked up confused. My mother raised an eyebrow. And I, with the same polite smile I had worn all night, said, "This might change the mood a little." And then I sat back in my chair and waited. Because sometimes, the loudest scream is made in absolute silence. There are moments in life, rare, potent, and surgically precise, when time does not stop, as people like to say, but instead stretches, widens into a slow and deliberate crawl, the way a predator approaches its prey not in haste, but with cold patience, knowing full well the fear is often more effective than the kill itself. That moment, as I slid the white envelope onto the table beside the cake knife Paige had just used to cut the first slice, was one of those moments. I didn't slam it down, didn't clear my throat or make some grand announcement. I simply laid it there, the way one might set down a folded napkin, and then, without raising my voice or altering the rhythm of my breath, I said what I'd rehearsed in my head for weeks: this might change the mood a little. And God, how it did. At first, no one moved. The room, bathed in the low amber glow of chandelier light and dimmed just enough to feel intimate, held its breath in unison. Paige, fork halfway to her mouth, looked at the envelope as though it might contain anthrax or a wedding invitation from an ex. My mother's lips parted slightly, the beginnings of a question forming, but her eyes told the story: suspicion, confusion, and a reflexive flicker of judgment, as if she already assumed it must be something petty or misguided. Something befitting the daughter who, in her eyes, had always thrived more in bitterness than success. Ron shifted in his seat, trying to pretend this didn't concern him, while Tyler, dear, well-groomed Tyler, suddenly found the buttons on his sleeve immensely interesting, his eyes dropping to the linen tablecloth with the practiced blankness of a man who knows what's coming and is already trying to brace for impact. Paige was the one who broke the silence, though not with words at first. She reached toward the envelope slowly, almost reluctantly, as if drawn to it not by curiosity, but by obligation. Her fingers hesitated at the edge of the paper, then lifted the flap with careful precision, and what came next unfolded not all at once, but in stages. The first page pulled free, her eyes scanning the first few lines, the crease between her brows deepening, her lips tightening into a line so thin it looked like it might vanish. Then came the second page. And the third. I watched her face more closely than I'd ever done in our entire lives. Not because I wanted to see her suffer, though I won't lie, part of me did, but because I needed to know exactly when the lie cracked. And there it was, right between the second and third pages, when she blinked too many times and her nostrils flared slightly, and I saw that she wasn't just confused. She was hurt. And underneath that hurt, there was something worse: disbelief. What is this?" she asked, not in the tone of someone demanding an explanation, but in the soft, desperate voice of someone hoping it isn't what they think it is. Her voice wobbled slightly, and that was the first moment I felt something in me hesitate. Just a flicker. "It's an email thread," I replied, my voice calm, perhaps too calm. "From Tyler. Sent to me 4 months ago." My mother leaned forward then, snatching one of the pages from Paige's trembling hands, scanning it with her eyes moving too fast to comprehend, but slow enough to stall for time. I could almost hear her brain assembling the defenses. This must be a joke, a misunderstanding, a manipulation. But there was no mistaking Tyler's name in the header. No denying the timestamp, the desperate tone in his words, or the implications stitched into each sentence like a ticking bomb. The flirtations, the confessions, the drunken messages filled with longing and regret and apology for things we probably shouldn't have done, though nothing, technically, had happened. Tyler's voice finally entered the room, brittle and strained. "That's not what it looks like." My mother cut him a sharp look, and for once said nothing. Paige stared at him, the pages clutched in her hands like pieces of a marriage license gone up in smoke. "Is this real?" she asked him, her voice hollow. "It was a mistake," he said, too quickly, his tone defensive and practiced, like he'd been preparing this line for weeks. "I was drunk. It was stupid. Nothing ever happened." "That's not what you wrote," I said, still seated, still sipping from my now warm glass of wine. "You wrote that you couldn't stop thinking about that night. You wrote that you wished I hadn't left. You wrote that you felt guilty every time you looked at her." Paige looked like she might vomit. She stood abruptly, chair scraping against the hardwood, and turned away from all of us, clutching the papers against her chest like armor. For a long stretch of time, no one said anything. Tyler looked like he might cry, which, honestly, would have been easier for him than facing what he'd done. My mother, always so quick to fill silence with criticism or distraction, was, for once, utterly still. Then, without turning around, Paige asked the question that cut deeper than any of it. How long were you sleeping with him? It wasn't a scream or an accusation. It was a whisper. A plea. And yet it pierced through the room like a blade. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was trying to build tension or milk the moment, but because I wanted her to feel the full weight of the question. To let it hang there unclaimed, heavy with implication. I never slept with him, I said finally, looking directly at her back. Not once. But I could have. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of disbelief, betrayal, and something else, something none of them could name. My mother turned to me then, her face contorted with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not anger. Not disappointment. But something closer to resentment, as if she couldn't quite believe that I had done this, brought this mess into her carefully curated dinner party, tainted the sanctity of her perfect daughter's engagement. You did this on purpose, she said. I looked back at her, finally letting the years of bitterness sharpen in my voice. I did. And I waited. I waited until you all were laughing at me. Again. Paige turned around then, eyes red, cheeks flushed, voice cracking. Why didn't you tell me sooner? And there it was, the question I had asked myself 100 times, the question I had rehearsed answering, the one that cut closer to the truth than even the emails. I looked at her, not with cruelty, not with vengeance, but with something honest. Because I wanted you to feel what it's like to be the punchline. There is a silence that doesn't arrive gently, like the hush of night or the peace after an argument resolved. It arrives the way an empty room feels after furniture has been ripped out, the way air tastes when the fire is gone, but the smoke still hangs like a warning. That silence filled my house in the minutes after Paige's question, and no one, not my mother, not Ron, not even Tyler with his trembling hands, and the 1,000-yard stare of a man suddenly aware of what he's lost, had anything left to offer. Words had drained from the room like water through a cracked floorboard, leaving behind only the wreckage, crumbs on plates, wine stains on napkins, and truth smeared across the table like spilled candle wax. They didn't stay long after that. Ron, ever the escapist, was the first to move, clearing his throat awkwardly before mumbling something about giving everyone space and disappearing through the front door without looking back. My mother followed, of course, though not before casting one final look in my direction. Not quite fury, not quite grief, but a strange hybrid of both. The look a woman gives when her illusion of control has collapsed, but she refuses to admit she ever believed in it to begin with. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't even say my name. Just gathered her coat, adjusted her necklace, and walked out with her spine so straight it looked like she might snap in half if she bent even an inch. Tyler tried to speak, once, twice, but Paige wouldn't look at him, wouldn't acknowledge him, and when he finally understood that whatever piece of dignity he was hoping to salvage had already been buried beneath the wreckage, he left too. The front door clicking shut behind him like a period on a sentence no one wanted to write. That left Paige and me. She hadn't moved from the spot near the fireplace, still holding the now crumpled pages like they were sacred texts corrupted by heresy, her shoulders rigid, her eyes not angry but lost, like someone who had been staring at a map for hours only to realize the landmarks had all been lies. I didn't try to explain. There was nothing left to explain. The envelope had done its work, and now we were two women, two sisters, standing in the rubble of everything we'd spent our lives pretending wasn't broken. She turned to me finally, not with the fury I'd braced for, not with the slap across the face I probably deserved, but with the heavy, exhausted resignation of someone who'd just realized she'd been protecting the wrong person for years. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. You planned this, didn't you? I nodded. Slowly. No use denying it. I did. Her jaw clenched, not in anger, but in something deeper. Why? I took a deep breath, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to be sure my answer landed exactly as I meant it to, because I spent 20 years letting all of you believe I was small. Letting you laugh, letting you judge, letting you write me off as the one who never followed through. And I did that, Paige, because I thought keeping the peace was more important than telling the truth. I thought being the quiet one was noble. That if I just kept showing up, eventually someone would notice I never left. But they didn't. And they wouldn't. And I got tired of being invisible in my own life. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat down at the edge of the sofa like her knees had suddenly remembered they were allowed to bend, and for a long time, she just stared at the floor, the envelope resting on her lap like it might speak again if she listened hard enough. Then, without looking at me, she asked the question that surprised me more than anything else that night. Did you ever love him? It caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I hadn't expected her to care. I sat beside her, leaving enough distance between us to let her choose whether we were still sisters or just two people with a shared childhood. And then, after a moment, I answered her honestly. No, I didn't love him. I didn't even want him. But he wanted me, just long enough for it to matter, and for once, I wanted someone to see that I had the power to say no. Her eyes flicked toward me, sharp now, not cruel, but alert. So this was about proving a point? No, I said, and then paused. It was about reminding you I'm not the girl you think I am. I'm not the joke. I'm not the failure. I'm not your shadow. We sat like that for what felt like hours, maybe it was just minutes, but time became irrelevant, folded into the weight of what had been said and what couldn't be taken back. Eventually, she stood, the envelope still clutched in her hand, and looked at me like she was seeing something that had been in front of her the entire time, but had only now come into focus. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, she said. I nodded again. I didn't ask you to. She left without hugging me, without promising to call, without telling me we'd work it out. And that was fine. Because for once, I didn't need her permission to feel whole. The next morning, the silence in my house was different. Not empty, but clean. Like the air after a storm that knocks the power out and peels the paint off the walls, but somehow leaves you standing, breathless, blinking into the daylight. There were dishes to wash, napkins to gather, wine glasses to rinse, but I moved through it all with a strange, quiet ease, like someone who had finally finished a chapter they never had the courage to start. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it slowly, half expecting Ron returning with some forgotten coat or maybe my mother come to retrieve her pride. But it was Paige. Alone. No makeup, no polished composure, just her, standing on my porch with her hair unbrushed and her face raw. She didn't speak for several seconds, and I didn't push her to. Then she said, "I'm not here to talk about him." I stepped aside, letting her in. She sat on the same sofa, in the same spot, but this time without the envelope. "I just have one question," she said. I waited. "When did you know that I would never be on your side?" That question, it hurt more than the slap I'd been expecting. Because the truth was I didn't know. Not until she laughed. I looked at her steady. "The moment you smiled when she said I was nothing." She closed her eyes, and for a second I thought she might cry. But she didn't. "I didn't mean to laugh," she whispered. I nodded. "I know. But you did." She left again that evening, this time without a word. And I didn't follow her. Because some gaps are meant to remain. Not as punishments, not as walls, but as memorials to the version of yourself that you finally buried. The one who begged to be seen. The one who waited for someone else to hand you back your worth. And maybe, just maybe, it took burning down the family dinner to finally feel free.